This is the Sports and Society podcast, where we go beyond scores, statistics, and personalities to focus on issues and controversies in sports worlds. Your hosts, Jay Coakley and Jeff Montes de Oca, are sports sociologists and the authors of the book, Sports and Society, Issues and Controversies. The episodes in this podcast give you a behind-the-scenes look at the textbook with stories from our lives as scholars and athletes, as well as providing analysis of ongoing issues and controversies in contemporary sport worlds. We welcome hearing your thoughts and analysis, so please use this space to engage with us about the textbook or any of the topics we cover in this podcast. Hi, and welcome to the fifth episode of the Sport and Society podcast. This episode, we're going to focus on Chapter 4, Organized Youth Sports, Whose Interests Do They Serve? As always, your hosts are Jay Coakley and me, Jeff Montes de Oca. Hey, Jay, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Jeff. So good to be with you today.
Yeah, it's great. So let's get started. I want to start this episode by focusing on two key concepts in sociology that have animated a lot of the discussions we've already had so far this season. And these concepts are agency and structure. And we're going to see that these are intertwined concepts. So in sociology, we define agency simply as the meaningful choices that a person makes over their body from within a limited range of options. And I think it's important to keep in mind that agency is fundamental to how we define what it means to be human. And it's a really important concept in sociology because it's crucial to the operation of democracy. We all need to participate in democracy, right? The governance of society is to make important decisions over our own lives, our bodies. The other term, structure, we might think of this as the institutional organization of society that both enables meaningful choices, but it also sets limits on the choices we make. So structure, and this is it can be a little confusing because it's sort of a paradox. Structure simultaneously enables and constrains our ability to act and make choices. And I just want to emphasize that in sociology, right, we don't have a concept of free will. I mean, we understand the concept, but it's not one that we use. We talk about agency that's both enabled and constrained. And that brings us to the chapter that we're discussing in this episode. So when we say organized youth sports, we're talking about an institutional structure that can both foster or inhibit children's agency, and then by extension, their citizenship. So if sport is a socializing institution, as we argued in the last episode, then its ability to enable greater agency in people is important to the operation of democracies. So, Jay, it seems like in every episode, we have talked about how youth sports have changed since we were kids. And I hope people listening don't think that we're just being nostalgic or talking about the good old days when we were kids, when things were wild and woolly. And that's not our point, right? What I think we've been doing is thinking out loud about institutional changes over time and what they mean for people and society. So the first question I have for you that I'd love you have you address, Jay, is can you just start us off by giving us a brief overview of the history of youth sports?
Well, youth sports are a relatively recent invention, and it's tied to the interest in society to, on the one hand, control the development or control young people generally, and to influence their development. And the United States has a kind of a unique history when it comes to youth sports because we were attached to England for a number of years. When England won the Battle of Waterloo and basically put Napoleon Bonaparte out of business in terms of influencing English society. The Duke of Wellington, way back in 1857, was talking about that victory, and he was a graduate of Eton School in England, which was, in our terms, one of the most exclusive private schools for males in England. And while he was talking about the victory over Bonaparte, he said that victory was born on the playing fields of Eton. And that's where the victory was won. And what his case was that the sports that they played at Eton created a combination of leaders and people who were rule followers and obedient to leaders. And that made good military people, and that's who won the Battle of Waterloo. And now in the United States, people were familiar with that, and there was an attempt to try to copy some of the English elite schools in the United States, but the United States was unique because at that particular time, we were a country of immigrants, and we were in the early stages of industrialization. And the urban areas at that particular time were not fun places to be. I mean, the pollution was heavy. There were tenements for houses. There was a lot of overcrowding. There was very little general social integration. There was some integration within different ethnic groups, but not an overall American integration. And so the United States was dealing with challenges that they weren't dealing with in England. But once people started to understand that if you controlled the environment within which young people grew up, you could control their development. You could influence their development. And this whole notion of sport building character, which was the Duke of Wellington's case, transferred over to the United States quickly. And they used that notion of sport building character to create sports for boys. And that started right at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, and the progressive era. And the idea was that we can take organized sports and we can use them to get all of these immigrant kids who were causing a lot of trouble because their parents were both working, and there was very little internal controls within their neighborhoods in many cases. And they were out playing in the streets, and there was a need to control them, but not just control them. There was a need to socialize them, to be good workers, to be obedient to authority, to know how rules worked, to be good teammates, within work situations. And for the wealthier families that had been around for a while, organized sports was seen as a way to build leaders. So basically, it was a perfect fit for the schools at that particular time. What we can do is we can take these boys from relatively wealthy households, and we can put them in organized sports and turn them into leaders. We could defeminize them because they were growing up at home with mothers. Their fathers were at work. And a lot of people thought that those wealthy boys were growing up too feminine. So they were too soft. Sports was going to turn them in not just to strong leaders, but people who were tough. And at the same time, it was going to take all those immigrant boys and get them off the streets and put them into structured settings where they could be controlled and socialized in the way that was needed in the United States at that particular time. So, so that's how organized sports got started in the U.S. There weren't community-based programs so much, except for some summer programs. So most of the organized sports for young people were in the schools. And now, at the same time, kids still made up their own games and played pickup games, informal games. So there was quite a bit of balance. I mean, there was organized sports on the one hand, but then there were neighborhood-based informal sports on the other.
And Jay,
that's the way.
Jay, just to be clear, you're talking right now about 19th into the early 20th century.
Right. So right now we're talking about the early 20th century and the expansion of American education, public education, and the emphasis on mobility, the emphasis on a need for productive workers, on military personnel, on patriots. We wanted to Americanize all of these young people in immigrant groups. And for the boys, sport seemed to be the tool to use. For girls, it was domestic training. And the sports were not organized for girls. They were organized by and for men, for boys. And that was the way things were, basically, until the 1970s in terms of gender. But my point here is that school sports and a few community sports and informal games was the structure of how young people participated in sports all the way through the 19-teens, 20s. Then the Depression hit. I mean, the first World War hit in 1918 or 17, and then it was the Great Depression, and then it was World War II. And it wasn't until after World War II, as suburbanization started to occur in the United States, that parents started to think, we need to organize more sports for kids. We're living in these suburban areas. Social integration wasn't real strong as people started to move in. So youth sports were created to provide opportunities for kids to play with one another under the control of adults. And now, at that particular time, informal games still were existing. And kids, picked sides and had played baseball, football, the American sports, basically. When I was growing up, there was no soccer. So these were the sports that were invented, so to speak, in the United States. So it wasn't until after World War II that the Little League organizations started to really get going. They had been formed in 1939, but they were slowed down by World War II. And they didn't really start growing until the post-war years, especially in the suburban areas. And where there were open spaces, baseball diamonds were built by park and recreation programs and so on. And that's when we really started to have the organized, adult-controlled youth sports, within which kids had very few choices. It was everything was set up. It was imposed on kids. The rules, the ways practices occurred, the way games occurred, and so on. So they liked organized sports because they got uniforms. They for the first time had opportunities on television to see major league sports, Major League Baseball, and some football and basketball. And so they were willing, in a sense, to give up some of their agency to participate in a structure that they had seen adult professional players engage in, and so they were relatively happy with playing organized sports, but they also complemented their involvement in organized sports with their own pickup games.
And one thing I would just add to this history, particularly the post World War II period, a lot of this was also really driven by the federal government in reaction to developments in Europe and fear of the Soviet Union because of the Cold War. And so there was a lot of emphasis, starting with Eisenhower, I think it was 1954, to really foster community level sports that would get kids active, because there was a lot of anxiety about television, cars, washing machines, taking away the rigors that earlier generations had experienced.
Yeah, and that, being prepared too within the Cold War context was absolutely crucial. And the federal government got involved, and not just the federal government, these were local governments too, got involved in providing opportunities for people to buy houses in suburban areas. My father got his VA loan after the Second World War, and that enabled our family to eventually get a house in the early 1950s in just north of Chicago in a suburb. We lived right across the street from a park that was totally maintained by the local park and rec department. They had summer programs. They hired high school students to run those programs. There were a wide range of sports and equipment that could be borrowed and used in those programs. They were all free. It was really interesting. We were living at the height of capitalism in little socialist enclaves where the local community was providing all sorts of publicly funded services for middle-income people, for basically, and enabling people to buy houses in those areas. So basically, it was a form of government support that today would be seen as suspect. It would violate the whole emphasis on individual responsibility. When in the post-war period and in the 1950s and early 1960s, the emphasis was on community responsibility for a large part of the United States.
So I just want to add two things to that, to your last few points. One, which is, I think it's important to recognize that these post-World War II, coming out of the New Deal, that community emphasis that you're talking about, the kinds of loans that some families could get were not race neutral, that these policies were explicitly a type of affirmative action to support white families to gain middle-class status. And this has a variety of implications. So, for instance, my maternal grandfather, I mentioned in our first episode, I believe, who was Jewish, he was born in Chicago in 1911, 1913, I forget the exact year. He was not white. He was a kike, born in a cold water tenement. And in the family, we could tell this narrative of personal responsibility, of how hard he worked, and that allowed him to move into the middle class, and sport was a part of it. But he was eligible for FHA loans. The type of work he did that a lot of Black families and Latinx families were not eligible for because of the type of work they did. And this is really this moment where we see this huge family wealth gap develop between white families and not white families. And that was crucial for my grandfather becoming white. And my mom's generation of Ashkenazi or Northern and Eastern European Jews being white. So that's a really important part of this history. And another thing is this is also the time period in which women's sports, girls in women's sports, is really beginning to change and lays the groundwork for Title IX, which we'll talk about in a later episode. But what year was the Helsinki Olympics? Was it 56 or
1952, I believe.
I think it's 1952. I think you're right about that. And a listener could Google it to make sure we got our year right. But the important thing here is the Helsinki Olympics is the first time the Soviet Union participates in an Olympic Games, and the Soviet women dominated. Again, part of this Cold War, there was a huge reaction in the United States. Why are our girls getting beaten by their girls? We need to start investing in women's sports. And so my mom had access to sport that her mother didn't have. And then the women in my generation, I was in high school in the 1980s. Well, we're 10 years post Title IX, and women and girls sports was beginning to flourish at that time. And so we're really one of the things that's really important from a sociological perspective, and why we're taking this time to talk about this history, is that we can't understand what's going on right now if we don't see the changes that have taken place over time, and why people were making decisions in the past, and how those decisions in the past affect the decisions we make now in the present. So you've really outlined these different periods in the history of U.S. sport. And right, so we talk about the 19th century, the turn of the 20th century, the middle of the 20th century. We'll talk more about the present in a little bit. But each of these periods describes structural changes in youth sports that has occurred over time. And again, we're thinking about that relationship of structure and agency. So can you now talk about some of the key institutional changes that have impacted youth agency?
Yeah, I think that initially, one of the things that affected agency was the fact that organized youth sports, especially in the suburban areas where Little League started, where other organized youth sports were developed. Yeah, and I think youth sports became the epitome of that adult organized context within which kids grew up in the 1950s and the 1960s. Boys, I'm talking about in particular. By the way, girls weren't allowed to play Little League Baseball until 1974, which was a couple of years after Title IX was passed. And so girls were still stuck in cheerleading and what I called, and other people have called, the grace and beauty sports. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about gender in a later episode. But basically, girls were playing sports that were ladylike. They didn't play team sports. They played sports that involved graceful body movements. They played sports, if they were directly competitive, that had nets between them and their opponents, or lane dividers between them and their opponents, so that there was no touching or physical contact. Even in basketball, the first basketball rules for girls were 6 players on a team. 3 could play offense and 3 could play defense. And because they didn't want girls running too much, because they just didn't have the endurance that boys had, and they didn't want to make them run full court. So because girls were fragile.
It was
So
also argued that running and exercise hardened their reproductive organs, and we didn't want that.
right, yeah, and by the way, the baseball excluded girls because they felt that if a ball hit a girl in the chest, in the breast region, that it would make her susceptible to breast cancer in the future. Or if she was tagged at second base, sliding in, and the glove with the ball in it hit her in the chest, those were all things that were going to hurt her ability to be a true woman, and have kids, be able to nurse their kids, and so on. So girls were discouraged for a number of stereotypical reasons. Certain sports were going to strengthen the muscles in the abdominal region and make pregnancies more difficult, make deliveries more difficult. So, and these were all wrong in terms of the biology of things, but we didn't know that at that particular time. And mothers and fathers discouraged their daughters from playing sports that were strenuous. So girls did play a few sports, but they weren't team sports, and they weren't the really strenuous sports. So, and there was a priority given to domestic kinds of learning, and domestic activities. So anyway, the agency that boys had during the 1950s, when they went into Little League, they lost some of that agency in the Little League context itself, because they didn't make up the rules, they didn't choose the sides, they didn't make the calls, they didn't make adjustments. All of that was done by coaches. So they started to lose agency, but they were still playing a lot of informal games where they were in control of things, and they created those games to maximize action, personal involvement in the action, controlled challenges so that games didn't get lopsided, and to make and reaffirm friendships. That's where the agency occurred, within those settings. And it occurred around creating action, and that was enjoyable for everybody. But once adults got a hold of baseball, what they did is they wanted a pitcher who would strike out 18 batters in 6 innings, when the 3 things that the kids loved most in baseball was hitting a ball, catching a ball, throwing a ball, and running. So 4 things. And those were the 4 things the coaches wanted to eliminate. We didn't want a batter to hit, because a player might make an error or throw the ball away. And once somebody was out on the base paths, it was more difficult to control them out there. So a coach would be happy with 18 strikeouts. And that would be the worst possible case scenario for any young boy who wanted to hit, catch, throw, and run. And that was the basis for fun. And I did research back in the 70s that basically outlined that. When I talked to kids playing organized sports and asked them, what was the most fun you had? And what was the least fun? And, putting in a baseball context, the least fun was being out in the outfield and never touching the ball in a 6-inning game. And so that was a problem. When I played baseball back then, I took a look at what was going on and tried out for catcher, because that gave me a chance to be in on every pitch. And so I could tell the pitcher what to throw, curveball, fastball, whatever. So, there were certain opportunities for agency within organized sports, but not many. So, and those opportunities for agency have even declined further as sports have become defined as more important, as adults have imposed more of their will on what kids are doing. So, so that has changed childhood in certain ways for boys, and girls went through some of that. But sport, I think, was really atypical in terms of eliminating the agency of players.
There are so many different things to dig into there that you're talking about, Jay. And again, I'm trying to keep in mind the structure agency terms and their relationship to each other. And one of the things that I'm hearing you talk about are competing ideologies, right? And within sport, competing ideologies within sport, right? And by ideology here, what I'm talking about, like these systems of knowledge, the values, the norms, the conventions, all of these different things. And so with kids, the focus is on fun, pleasure, experience, movement, participation, friendship. With the adults, the sporting ideology is on performance, outcomes, wins, losses, those sorts of things, keeping statistics, right? Control. And so and then these ideologies, these systems of knowledge become embodied in the sport as an institution. Then that creates a context where kids could have more or less agency. So if we think about the sporting experience of the girls, it is highly constrained by gender ideology as it operates through the sport institution, where they have fewer games they can even participate in. The rules are more controlling when they're in those games in all the ways that we talked about. For the boys, it has become much more adult-centered, much more controlling, although they have a greater range of agency because they have more games that they can participate in. But still, it's increasingly run by adults, and the kids need to be effective, efficient, powerful within that sport, but at the same time, respectful for authority. In this mid-20th century and into the present, we see that increasingly in the workplace also. That the parallel to suburbanization is the growth of large corporations in the middle of the 20th century. So whether it's larger factories or larger office spaces or whatever, and increasingly there's a greater hierarchy in those larger corporations that men need to fit into. And they need to be effective and efficient in their jobs, but they also need to be deferential to authority in their jobs. And so again, the sport institution that's forming in this time is connected to other broader changes that are going on in not just the United States. I mean, this is going on, all over North America and Europe and other places. And that's becoming, right, again, the point that you're making, increasingly controlling. And I wonder, because we talked about this in the previous episode, resistance, right? And resistance by implication means agency. How, when you're being controlled, do you express agency in the socializing process? What might be some ways in this context that the youth might be expressing resistance? And it might not be conscious, it might not be intentional, or it might be, but ways in which youth might be resisting greater adult control over youth sports?
Yeah, I think that 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 kids look for opportunities to exercise control within organized youth sports, and certain sports give them more latitude than other sports. It's kind of interesting that football has become the most popular in terms of just numbers of kids of boys playing youth sports, when football has the least amount of action of any of the sports that young people play. You know, when we watch an NFL game, we watch it for over 3 hours, and there's only between 11 and 14 minutes of action that you see, depending on how many instant replays there are. So we're spending between 11 and 15 minutes watching a sport for 3.5 hours, and uh, only 11 to 15 minutes consist of real action. All the rest.
And just to be clear there, people have brought stopwatches, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Jay's not making this up.
No.
People have literally take stopwatches and measure the amount of time in a broadcast of actual action versus the actual broadcast time. Sorry, Jay.
Right. And by the way, I've held that stopwatch for a number of games, college and pro football games, and baseball games. So, you know, what happens with baseball and football is that there are so many breaks in the action that the adult coaches can control everything that's going on. In basketball, it's a little tough. It's a little more difficult. In soccer, it's a little more difficult because there's constant movement. So, and so the action is much greater in terms of minutes than it is in baseball and football. So, so basically, the sports that are most popular in the United States, or have been, are sports within which players have very little agency. And I think that now, as sport leagues have grown and become corporatized in certain ways, they've separated from park and recreation departments. You have even less agency because the rules are coming from outside of your community. In many cases, they're coming from a league office, and they're coming to the adults who coach the teams and run the local leagues. And the players are the last ones to have some kind of a say in what's going on, in when the practices are going to be, how the practices are going to happen. Now, kids will screw. I'm using this term loosely. They'll screw around during practice, and coaches will get frustrated and yell at them. That's one of the only ways they can resist, and is by basically doing something that's outside the organized structure of a practice. And they wouldn't dare do that in a game for the most part. But, you know, the game is strictly rule controlled, and the rules are interpreted and applied by the adults, not by the kids. So, and that's one of the differences between the informal games and the organized adult control games. The informal games are participant controlled, and they're the ones that make up the rules and enforce the rules, come up with rule qualifications in order to maximize action involvement, controlled challenges, and reaffirming their relationships with each other. So, so it enables young people to be creative and spontaneous. And being creative and spontaneous in organized youth sports is difficult for kids. You know, you get creative, and coaches will tell you, we don't do that. And you know, when you're in a pickup game, you know, you can, in basketball, you can take a long shot. And once you get a coach, they want to work it into the middle and get the good shots, so to speak. If I was taking shots when I was playing basketball in college that Caitlin Clark is taking now as a University of Iowa basketball player, I would have been benched. The coach would have pulled me out right away and said, Coakley, we don't shoot from out there. We work it around. We get our 10-foot jump shot. That's what we're working for. We're not working for a 25-foot jumper from, way beyond the top of the key. And so I think that there are some changes in sports that give some players a little bit more latitude when it comes to how they're going to play offense, at least in a sport like basketball. But that's kind of unique. For the most part, coaches are controlling things, when you should take a pitch in baseball and, what blocking assignments you have in football and so on. So young people are enjoying the physical movement. They're enjoying the teammates. They're enjoying all the attention they're getting. They like it when their parents carry all their equipment to the game and make sure that they eat right and get their treats after the game and all of that. But that's not agency. That is just, in a sense, a status within the family, and maybe you can take advantage of that status every now and then and turn it into agency, but you have to be pretty clever to do that.
So, Jay, in fairness, on your best day, you were no Caitlin Clark.
That's right.
And not everybody on the team gets to be Caitlin Clark. Right. In fairness.
That's right.
But, I'm joking, of course. But so as I think about like adult reactions to youth resistance to adult control, a lot of times it gets couched in the language of kids these days. And I heard that as a kid, right? And so when I started doing research on youth fitness in the 1950s, I was really shocked that my grandparents' generation was describing my parents' generation as a bunch of couch potatoes, because my parents' generation, my parents were like, my dad was born in 1939, so pre-war. My mom was a war baby, but a lot of my teachers were boomers. They were calling us couch potatoes. So I was really shocked that was the language used about them in their day, and they were lazy, and popular culture has all these negative impacts on youth. They would rather do what's easy, like watch television in my day and my parents' day. Now we talk about social media and doom scrolling and all these sorts of things as somehow being really turning our youth into slackers. Can you sort of talk about this language of anxiety about youth and the youth's embrace of popular culture in regards to this resistance about control?
So there's a number of things going on in society that have really restricted young people in ways that minimize their opportunity for free movement, free physical movement. And in the 1950s and 60s, oftentimes children would get on bikes and they would go places their parents didn't know where they were going. They didn't know how long they were going to be gone. There was quite a bit of freedom. And what happened was that when both parents started working outside the home, they started to look for programs where their kids could be controlled by adults, and because they weren't there to control them. And so that was the first one of the first changes. Then there was a major cultural shift in what it meant to be a good parent. And, my parents never knew or seldom knew where I was and what I was doing. But move into the 1980s and things started to change. And the good parent was one that knew the whereabouts and the behavior of their kids 24/7, 365. And if you didn't know the whereabouts and behavior of your children, then people would start looking at you as being neglectful. And by the way, parents being responsible for their kids 24/7 every day of the year, that was a first in human history. And no other parents in human history were held to that standard to be defined as a good parent. And and then there was a growing belief that if we allowed young people, especially boys, to be out there on their own, that they were going to get into trouble. That was kind of the Lord of the Flies syndrome, where if you didn't control or put external controls on young people, they were going to be threats to the social order. And so we had to organize their activities, and sports was the main one. Organize sports so that they wouldn't get into trouble, keep them off the street, so to speak. And then one of the other things that was going on is as local news programs used fear-inducing stories about kids getting kidnapped or, getting lost and, being missing and so on, parents got really concerned that the world wasn't safe for their kids to have agency. They needed the kids to be in controlled programs where adults had, set up boundaries so that there wouldn't be any problems that their kids faced. And so those kinds of things started to change the whole approach within families, within the whole socialization mechanisms for kids. And youth sports, as well as dance lessons, music lessons, and other kinds of adult-controlled activities after school and in the evenings, those kinds of things were seen by many parents as absolute necessities in order to keep their kids on the right track and in order to prove their moral worth as parents.
Okay, so now we're really getting into the present era with youth sport, and there's this shift, and we've talked about this in previous episodes, away from more public spaces, youth-controlled, to increasingly private spaces, pay-to-play type youth sports. Can you talk a little bit more specifically about this? And a lot of times it's called a neoliberal model of youth sport, because we're really moving into the market and private, right? The private. So can you talk a little bit more about this and how it reconfigures family, as well as the youth activity, how the entire family becomes invested in the future of the child vis-a-vis this paid for sport experience?
Right. And, parents were always invested in their children, but they didn't see the necessity to know their whereabouts and behavior 24/7. But when these changes that I've just mentioned started to occur, parents got desperate, and they wanted to make sure that their kids weren't getting into trouble, because they would be partly blamed for their kids getting into trouble. So parents were motivated to pay to have their children controlled by adults in activities that were culturally valuable. And sport was one of those culturally valued activities. And so parents were willing to make sacrifices with the discretionary money that they had in their households to pay for their kids to play. And the families that couldn't pay, their kids didn't play. And that started to prioritize and give advantages to kids from middle and upper middle class homes. And if young people from lower income homes and lower income neighborhoods wanted to play sports, they weren't in pay to play programs for the most part. They were in school programs where it was free. And what were the big school sports? They were basketball, baseball, volleyball, track and field. And when you look at who's playing in those sports at the elite levels, you find that lower income families and kids in those families were able to develop excellence in the sports that were sponsored free in the schools. But all the other sports, the so-called minor sports, the non-revenue generating sports, it was white middle-class kids who were playing in those sports. And because their families had the resources to not only pay the dues and the admissions fee or the registration fees and all that, but they had the transportation to get to the practices, to get to the games, and to buy the equipment needed to participate in those things. So what we started to see was that social class started to become a major factor within access to participation in organized sports. And that has become even more apparent today in the 2020s than it was back in the 1980s or 90s. Social class is much more important now than it was then.
I mean, that's such a good point, because we have this discourse, this way of thinking about sport in the United States as it's an avenue of mobility for poor people. And like that's the narrative in my family. For my grandfather, for my father, they were both very poor kids, and they were able to move their families into the middle class, and their sport participation was a big part of that. But when we think about sport, like success in competitive sports, as in part the qualities of the athlete, their physical qualities, their mental qualities, but also success in sport has a lot to do with the resources available to a person. What facilities do you have to train in, and the coaching and what access to coaching, to training, to medical staff. And so we think of sport as this avenue of social mobility, but a lot of elite sport is increasingly moving out of the cities and into the suburbs where people are resource wealthy. And I want to shift now a bit, because we're getting a little tight on time here, and I want to think about the focus on lower income, poor, working class youth. And one of the things we talk about in the chapter is the limitations of the deficit reduction model when it addresses, quote unquote, at-risk youth. A lot of the students that in my classes, they really struggle with the critique that you outline. And I think to a large degree, it's because many of the assumptions of the deficit reduction model is consistent with their own way of thinking, what we would call their common sense. So can you just clarify a bit the arguments about the limitations of using sport in a deficit reduction model to address at-risk youth? Yeah, and address why we're so quick to accept the assumptions of the deficit reduction model.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this relates to social classes as well. You know, when upper middle class people pay to have their kids play, they're assuming that their kids are going to be learning leadership skills, that they are going to move into management positions, that they are going to be decision makers, and they're going to make money doing that. When kids from lower income families and neighborhoods participate in sport, there is also a focus on potential mobility, but it's a different approach. Instead of nurturing existing aptitudes and assets that young people have, what the people running youth sports for kids from those low income neighborhoods want to do is they want to make up for all of the things that those kids don't have. The assets that those young people do not have. And so they want to train them in ways that will make them be productive as adults. But in order to do that, they impose a middle-class model on those young people and say that if we can make those kids like our middle-class kids, then they're going to be okay. They're going to experience mobility. However, they don't talk about the contexts within which those young people are living, context within which there are not economic opportunities, contexts where there aren't public resources available to fund certain kinds of experiences, contexts within which crime rates might be high, so kids can't have the freedom to find out more about where they live and what's going on in the world. So it's interesting. People are using sport as a substitute for making the structural changes that are needed to really create a foundation for upward mobility. What sport does is focus on individuals. It doesn't focus on communities. So what we want to do is we want to change this individual or these individuals so that we can develop some assets, make up for the lack of assets that they have, so that they can experience some success as adults. And people buy into that. And by the way, they're buying into it with sport without a heck of a lot of proof. Do we know that young people who participate in certain kinds of sports really are more mobile than kids who don't participate in those sports? And this is apart from anybody who becomes one of those less than 1%ers who actually makes money playing sports. So, but that's the goal of a lot of young people from low-income neighborhoods that are under-resourced. They figure that their only chance for mobility is to get out. And what they need to get out is to move through a school-based pipeline of sports skill development that will take them to a point where maybe they can go to college, or maybe they can play a sport where they can make some revenue in the process. So it's a very different set of experiences for kids growing up in those under-resourced neighborhoods. Because nobody's trying to change those neighborhoods. They just want to, it's so much easier just to say, oh, the problem is these individuals don't have skills. So we're going to provide them with a sport, they're going to develop skills, and they're going to make it. Well, that's not what happens in the majority of cases.
Jay, you sound like such a sociologist. And this really is the debate that sociology has had, at least in the United States, with U.S. society. Because, and I think about like a movie like Gridiron Gang, right? And the argument of the movie is that it's set in a juvenile detention facility, and if you create a football team, the kids are going to learn, going back to the very beginning of this episode, character. They're going to learn middle class norms and customs, values. They'll learn a work ethic. They'll embrace determination and teamwork and all of these things. And that is going to turn their lives around. They'll go from being gangbangers to athletes. And and if they don't make it, then it's their own moral failure. And so poverty, inequality in the United States, but a lot of other places as well, gets discussed in very individualistic and moralistic terms. And what you're saying, and this is what sociologists always demand, is that we focus on the structural, the institutional conditions under which people are making, for them, reasoned choices. There is a reason why crime rates are high in poorer areas. There's a reason why people that live in violent communities will join gangs, right? It's actually not crazy. They're not crazy. They're not dumb. They're not any of those things. Given the reality of their lives, structural context in which they're making choices, these are oftentimes very reasoned choices that they're making. And that, again, it's that structure and agency. Structure both enables and inhibits the choices we make. And if we're in different structural contexts, we might have a greater range of choices, or we might have a more constrained range of choices. But we're always going to make our decisions based on the information available to us and what makes sense in that place that we're living at that time. Jay, I want to wrap us up now with the last question, and you know, my argument was just a little bit depressing, and we focused a lot on adult control over youth and youth's lack of agency. So I want to ask, to conclude, what gives you hope for and makes you excited about youth sport going forward?
Yeah, one of the things that I probably should have mentioned previously when we talked about resistance is the extent to which some young people, many young people, are getting involved in alternative and action sports where they can take control over what's going on. You know, skateboarding is very different than Little League baseball. And when you go to a skate park and watch what's going on, and you go to a Little League baseball game or a football game and watch what's going on, two totally different scenarios. And I think that young people, when they get turned off by organized sports that are adult controlled, some of them turn to alternative and action sports, which recreates the kinds of things that they define as fun. So that's one of the things that's hopeful. The other thing is that the skills and excellence model that we talk about in that chapter has all sorts of problems associated with it, and those problems are being recognized now. There's too much specialization. There's not enough development of physical literacy. Kids burn out. They injure out. They drop out. They're cut out. And what happens is that basically they end up sitting on couches, maybe, in some cases. But there are a number of people who are aware of that, and they're trying to develop alternatives to the skills and excellence model. And Project Play has a physical literacy and lifelong learning model. The coaches across continents have a growth and development model that is grounded in theory and has an associated methodology to produce development. So there are people who are starting to realize that playing sports
does not create some magic outcomes for people of any age. That if you want certain things to happen within an organized sport context, then you better start looking at the research. Under what conditions are young people going to have positive developmental outcomes? And under what conditions are they not? And there are all sorts of problems with our skills and excellence model. We don't have coaches that are trained, and I could go on and on here with the problems. But there are a number of people now who have identified those problems, and they're working to create new alternatives on a community by community basis for how to organize youth sports. They have to be age appropriate. They have to reflect they have to be child centered. They have to reflect what kids are interested in. I never had a youth sport coach ever ask me, and I've never seen any coach do this, what do you want? How do you define fun? What can we do in practices that would meet your interests and needs? And because they come with a ready-made package, even coach education in many cases just gives you a set of tactics and techniques that you bring and impose on your players, rather than giving your players some discretion and asking them, okay, if we want to learn how to do this, what are some of the other ways to learn it? And give them a sense of ownership within the activities. And that's the thing that gives me hope, is when adults say, we've got to help young people develop a greater sense of ownership. And that's another word for agency that I'm using, ownership within their organized sport experience. We need to give them opportunities to make more decisions.
One of the things I think I take away from this is movements that are research-based, not based on our older ideologies. Because it's so easy that, like, the common sense of today, the ideologies that guide us today, to just reproduce them ourselves in the things that we do. And it can be very hard to see. So, for instance, when we talked about women's sports in the middle of the 20th century, guided by these ideas that exercise would make the reproductive organs hard, or, strengthening the abdomen would make for a more difficult delivery, which the research shows is absolutely wrong, like the exact opposite. But that was the belief of the time, and it wasn't questioned for a very, very long time until people started to, question it and draw on research to say, no, in fact, having women and girls participating in sport is really, really healthy and good in a whole variety of different ways. And so there are all of these, and we talk about that in the chapter, unintended consequences of the current model of sport. Some things are really obvious, such as the repetitive stress injuries, the kinds of operations that young people now have to get, that just in the 70s and early 80s when I was growing up, you never heard of those things. I mean, yeah, we might break bones and things like that, but the kinds of repetitive stress injuries just weren't common at that time. The other thing you brought up the other day when you and I were talking offline, I'm just going to repeat what you said, as an unintended consequence of adults taking control over youth leisure activities and young people losing that control, is their attraction to things like technology, screens, video games. I've always said, like, what kid wants to watch a football game for 3+ hours passively when they could play NFL Madden and they can be the star? So then this unintended consequence of kids sitting around playing video games and social media where they have control becomes really appealing, because the adult context is unappealing because the kids don't have any control and the adults are creating the very thing that they say they're trying to prevent. So it is really exciting to see some of these other models and different ways of thinking about sport. And for the people that are listening, as you go through your college programs, whether you're in sociology or kinesiology or sport management, and some of you will go out and be sport professionals, thinking about, well, how can research-based programs help you achieve your actual goal and minimize the unintended consequences, as we've talked about.
Amen.
Well, all right, Jay, we're running long in this episode. I know youth sport has always been one of your passions. So we will say goodbye to our listeners for this episode, and we look forward to connecting with you in the next episode. We'll be talking about Chapter 5, Deviance in Sports. Is it out of control? Thank you very much, and look forward to the next episode.
Me too, Jeff. Take care. And again, we'd like to hear from people who will give us constructive criticism about how we're doing these podcasts.